Hi there and welcome to Kritfayle. I'm the Penguin, and I'm accompanied here with Ghost.
Hello.
And we're going to be discussing a couple tips for the new GM, so Ghost, take it away.
GMing is really one of the best things you can do if you're into role-playing games. It's a massively rewarding thing to be in charge of the story. You're shaping the story. You're not controlling the story completely. You're relying on the players to be giving you input. But when you first start out, there's a mass amount of things that can just sort of
mess with you.
Compound and, yeah, exactly, right?
A lot of confusing stuff really on how to do certain things and make the game kind of go in the direction you want, story-wise.
Exactly, and it's never going to. That's the thing. And it's not because players try to sabotage you or anything like that. There's always little things that get in the way. You could have a neon sign. You could have a billboard. You could have a newspaper headline. You could have a movie with the name of the plot on it. You could have a town crier yelling the plot, and you could have a donkey with the sign on it, and they would still sit there and look at you going, so what's this about? Things like that can happen.
Players will always find a way to derail a GM. It's just the nature of things.
So we sat down and sort of had a little bit of a think of some of the things that can be tricky for a new GM. And I think one of the first things that they often worry about is bad acting and looking silly. Mm-hmm. And this actually applies to both GMs and players. It's one that is equal. But a GM wants to bring the world to life. Now, he has a tricky job in a way with this, because with NPCs, he has to try to be different, or they have to try to be different with each character that they are doing. A player, on the other hand, only has to be themselves. I only have to play Ulgrath, the barbarian. I'm not having to play Ulgrath and
20 other NPCs.
Yeah. Right. So it's sometimes can get overwhelming, and you'll try to look for these different things. And one of the first things people will do is go, well, I'll do accents. And then they worry about all sorts of things. Are they being disrespectful? Are they sounding terrible? And the thing is, context is everything. This is a fantasy world. Any accent you do. And if you want to do a bad Australian accent, go for it. I am not going to take offense at having some scout out in the middle of the desert with a Crocodile Dundee accent. You go for it. That's not shiting on my country at all. You know what I mean? It's not. Yeah. It doesn't matter. You're not a voice actor. You're a dude playing in a game. You know, as long as it's not, the context isn't disrespectful, go for it. But I think they're worried about just sounding silly. And I think that also comes in with emotion as well, like we were talking about earlier, that you can have a game that can be really deep and start to be a lot more than just moving a mini on a piece of paper, or, you know, that sort of whole thing we're sort of saying how D&D can sometimes be a bit of a miniature game. Mm-hmm. That you start actually finding these moments, and the GM, if he suddenly lets himself go and creates this scene, and it can be tragic and sad, at the same time you can get this huge barrier jump up and go, am I going to sound completely stupid or just bad?
Mm-hmm. Am I going to do this as good as I want to in my head?
Right. And I think that happens a lot. And I think a lot of GMs then start to pull back. I think players too.
Oh, yeah.
They start worrying about...
It's typical, like, performance anxiety.
Absolutely. So I think that happens a lot when they've got NPCs, you know, and especially if it's an NPC situation that the players aren't directly involved with. Mm-hmm. And players can either help the situation or hinder it for the GM. If the GM has to do... Okay, there's a scene in one of the Rise of the Rune Lords where this little girl comes screaming and she says, my father's dead, my father's dead. And they go, and there's loads of ways to handle this, and the actual adventure gives you like two different ways, a sort of lesser way and then a more horror way. So the horror way is this goblin's been locked in the wall. Somehow it ended up in the house, and because they're small, ended up in the wall, and they heard it, and the dad put his head in and basically got it bitten the hell up and got killed. So I didn't handle it even back then the way I really would like to have done. Mm-hmm. But that's sort of one of those moments where, because the GM can be worried about he's trying to handle the little girl, which could be quite difficult for one, if you're an adult and a man. You got to try to, because little girls are sort of hard to emulate when it comes to acting if, you know, you're a middle-aged man. Obviously. So you get this block straight away where you're trying to create this emotional scene. Her father's been killed. You want it to be emotional.
But at the same time, you're worrying about, is my performance going to be, you know, any good?
Absolutely. Because you're trying to convey that emotion to the players, and you're hoping that they're going to get on board with this. And if they do, that's going to make your life so much easier. Mm-hmm. If, however, they sort of look at you and just sort of want to keep you giving them the information, the GM can then get in this wonderful sort of loop where he's NPCing between two different characters, and that can start to build this anxiety because now he's doing, if the mother and the little girl are both there, he's now trying to convey really heavy emotion between two characters to each other. So he's trying to find two different voices, two different styles, keeping it tragic and powerful and trying to get everyone involved. And if they're all sitting back going, okay, the anxiety can quite raise. So if the players, though, do get involved and do jump in, and that's why, this is a shared experience. And I think everyone has to not be afraid of putting themselves out there, especially if you're at a home game and not putting it out and streaming it or anything like that. If you're at a home game, it doesn't matter. The only people you're going to look silly in front of is the people at the table, and they're probably people you already know or your friends. And yeah, if you really screw it up, they might laugh at you, but it's usually going to be over. It's not going to have any lasting effects. So I think that it's really worth putting yourself into that moment. You know what I mean? Like you'll get so much more from the game once you start investing emotionally into the characters and the setting. Mm-hmm. And anger's easy. Most of the time, they'll do characters that are angry. Because that's the one emotion people aren't embarrassed by in a game sort of thing. Yeah. Being sad, crying, heartache, all that sort of thing. It's much more, I guess in a way, it's not so much unmanly. I don't think it's like
it's easier to just turn on the anger when trying to be convincingly sad is just not as easy.
I think it's a little bit more soul-bearing. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? To pull off tragedy, sadness, true sadness of having your lawful good paladin witnessing a child die that they maybe could have prevented, but even if they couldn't, and really deciding this is going to be a defining moment for my character and I'm really going to go with this. Mm-hmm. I think that sort of soul-bearing moment can be kind of harder
on newer players and newer GMs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think so. I definitely think that. But if you're willing to try, I think that it'll get easier. And you'll start to get more of those moments that you'll be talking about at a coffee shop with your other role-playing friends, or when two groups come together and they'll be saying, hey, this was great. The one you actually got praise for was in the second Rise of the Rune Lords, when the ghost was letting you see what happened through their eyes. And you actually got afraid. You actually, instead of doing the usual, hey man, did you see that? Did anyone else see that? Really? No one saw that? Which is what happens a lot of the time. Or they'll just say, I tell them what I saw. You freaked out. And it was good. You only were giving them half the information that I gave you. Mm-hmm. Because your character, you decided, was freaked out. Yeah. And that was great. And they automatically fell into it, which is that organic acting, which is great when it happens. Because you're going, did you see that? Oh my God, it was the woman. And they were like, what woman? What are you talking about? He's like, he stabbed her. Who? What's going on? And it just, the way that actually unfolded was probably one of the best moments in that actual adventure, the way that whole thing happened. And that only happened though because you took a chance. So I think that people really do just don't worry about it. Take a chance. What's the worst that can happen? One of the other things I think that's important is observation is key. It's such a massively important thing for a GM to be doing. He has to juggle this though, because he's got so much going on. It's very easy to be looking at only the rules, or you're trying to take those moments when the players are talking to each other to skip ahead and check something out, and which is fine. But the problem is that while you're doing that, you might not be paying attention to them as well. And that's one of the biggest skills a GM has to learn, is to be able to multitask between the physical stuff he has to do, but also the players, because there's lots of little things that might happen that's important. Mm-hmm. You can find Definitely. One of the big things, and this happens a lot, and new GMs fall into this trap, I found over the years quite a lot. And that is, you're going to have up to 7 people if you're doing Adventurers League, but a lot of games are 5. But even in 5-player games, you might get someone who will step forward and take the lead, or someone who is just naturally outgoing, and someone who is naturally not outgoing. The GM has to be always observant that he is not focusing only on the player or players who
are actually speaking up.
Right.
Like making sure that all the players kind of get an opportunity to voice themselves.
Totally. It sounds easy, but it's not. Because there's so many things that they're worrying about. They're thinking of the story. They're thinking about the next room. If it's a dungeon, they're thinking about the next encounter. They're thinking about the next moment. They're thinking about rules that might have to come into play. They might be answering questions. And it can become very easy to just be sitting there and have someone who's always being the, I do this, I ask that, I go here. Another thing, one thing that one GM did at Wood for Sheep that I liked, he said that whoever rolls, how did he put it? If everybody rolls, it's an automatic fail.
If everybody rolls?
Right, because I've seen this. Actually, I've seen this a bit. You probably did too if you were paying attention. There was, at one table we were at, and I'm not naming any names, because that's not what this is, but every time the GM said, we need a check, one person automatically rolled.
Okay.
He said, I'll do it, and he rolled. And only after that roll would he go, oh, maybe someone else is better at it.
I see.
The GM has to set the tone, I think, right from the beginning on how he wants skill checks. Now, I'm not saying that that player was doing it to hog the game or anything nefarious, but we're back to that sort of thing where we discussed separating characters to their skill checks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's very important, I think, for a GM to be very aware of how he words it. If he says, give me an Arcana check, chances are you're going to have 4 dice hit the table.
Oh, yeah.
And one GM I was with said if that happens, it's an automatic failure because he didn't want that happening. So I think that it's an extra thing on the GM, but to try to have him or her or they, sorry, there's a lot more girls playing. It's a natural thing.
Yeah.
We've had very few female GMs over the years. It's like in my experience, it's not that they're not out there. There's a lot more now than there ever was, but all my game groups were guys. So it's a natural thing I keep falling back on, but there's a lot more girl gamers now and that's awesome. Sorry, ladies. It's all Penguin's fault anyway. But I think it is important that they try to set that tone and especially right before the first dice is rolled, give them an idea about how you're going to handle skill checks. Right down to passive ones. Because it's hard for a player. There's only certain players who will go into harm's way against the dice. And what I mean is you go, I want to check for traps. All right, roll for it. Boom, 1. You don't see any traps. Maybe someone else needs to open the door, or maybe someone else wants to check for trap, because now they've fallen straight into metagaming.
Exactly.
So some GMs will do perception rolls, or I think that might even be why they added the passive perception, that the GM can just look at that and go, all right. But it's still if a player says, I'm going to actively check. If he fails that roll, there's only some. Bubbles does this, which I like. Bubbles will fail his roll and then say, I'm going to the door. Proudly and strongly will say, I'm just opening the door. There's no traps, guys. Follow me. And half the time there was a trap. But he'd just do it, right? And that's the joy of it, though, because he looked at the die roll, took the die roll as what he knew. And that's good role-playing.
Yeah.
But it is hard sometimes. I get it. I get why players will sometimes look at that and go, oh, Christ, I've just got a 1. Oh, I'm lost in the desert. I don't know where to go. Oh, I'm going to stay put. And it's like, but why did you choose that? Was it based on the die roll, or that's what your course of action was always going to be? Like, if you'd have rolled a 20, would it have changed the course of action? That's where the dice is getting in the way of the game sort of thing. But I think that that's an important thing. Keeping everyone involved, that observation, making sure that those quiet players aren't left out. Now, this can be even more noticeable if you've got a different age bracket in your game group. Now, one thing I'm really happy is Kritfayle. When she plays, she's going to be 12 in about 2 weeks. She speaks up. She doesn't sit there, and even though everyone else at the table ranges from about 20 to 45 to 55, I think, on one of the tables, she never sits back. She never lets other players talk over her. She never lets things, and that's awesome. That really is. But a lot of kids will naturally be more quiet in that sort of environment. And so the GM has to watch that. If he does have a kid or younger people in his group, make sure they're getting their go. Make sure they get a chance to speak up. Make sure if someone is rolling a dice for skill checks all the time that you stop that. You don't have to be a dick about it, but you got to stop that, because that roll might be getting in their way. If they're a ranger, they're going to be better at survival than the bard. They're going to be better at nature checks than the bard. Well, they should be. They should be. So make sure that the GM is doing that they're keeping that sort of concept. That way the quiet players, if they're a ranger and this is a survival check, don't just say, maybe give me a skill check. Maybe say to the ranger, give me a skill check. And it's very rare that members of the table will challenge the GM on that. Why did you choose the ranger for a survival check? You know what I mean? It's going to be a very small group of people that will actually challenge that.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're, you know what I mean? If you're giving weird stuff to weird things, you know, if you're telling the bard to do Arcana and he's got absolutely nothing in it, then the wizard or sorcerer might be saying, why did you go that route? Why didn't we roll it? But they're not going to say, why did you ask the ranger to make a survival check?
Yeah.
So just keep in mind, quiet players can easily get left out of games.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is prepping. You can over-prep and you can under-prep, but prepping is the key for a new GM. Understand the rules as best as you can, but more importantly, understand the characters and understand the adventure that you're going to be doing. It is vital. It will make the game smoother, but more importantly, it will make your life as a GM smoother, much smoother.
And I think a good one that leeches off from that is anticipating your players not to follow your plan at all, at every point.
Right.
Like, have contingency plans for in case they do something that they're not meant to, or they do find themselves in a situation that they're not exactly supposed to be in.
And that's going to happen all the time.
Oh, yeah.
But you can over-prep. You can over-prep to the point where you're losing connection to what's actually meant to be happening. And it's almost like you've tried to soak up all this information, and then when it happens, it's almost like you're completely unprepared. It's one of the weirdest things that happens. But I've watched GMs who prepped for like a month for a game come apart right at the start, the moment someone didn't do what they expected, which is sort of like what you were saying. But it seems to happen with over-prep. But definitely don't under-prep. Make sure you understand the adventure. You've got to understand the adventure, no matter what. You've got to understand what that adventure is, because otherwise you're going to run into lots of problems. Players are going to say, can they do this? Can they steal this? Is this a big deal if we destroy this? And a GM can go, yeah, sure, go for it. And then suddenly at the end, there's something massively important that's been massively now screwed up from something that happened at the start because they haven't read the adventure. Another one that's tricky is players don't know what to do. There will be times when players look at you with deer in headlights. And we almost had that last Thursday where the person we were meeting got assassinated. We had been implicated in something even before we got there. We had arrived there to answer for that implication. Then he gets killed in our presence, and the town watch basically was trying to arrest us. We caused trouble for the GM because there was no clear outline when it went down if we were meant to fight or if we were meant to flee. So what ended up happening was the party did all of the above. We had one member jump from the balcony and try to flee into the crowd. We had 2 members or 3 members flee the opposite way down the passage, and then they surrendered. And the paladin, the ranger, and my rogue were basically knocking the guards out, and we got to a point where we were pretty sure we could fight our way out of this. But behind us, half the party had surrendered. The GM wasn't quite sure how to handle this, because this wasn't what was meant to happen. Completely. We weren't sure what we were meant to do. Now, obviously, a game is always fluid and things are changing and happening, but at the same time, we are faced with an adventure. There's stuff going on.
Yeah.
We didn't know what was expected of us. So it got quite complicated, and that's something that is, I think is really important. You've got to understand sometimes players don't know what to do. It's not always that they're just going to stand there looking at you. If you offer them a job and say, follow me, and walk into the hall, and the players all stand around going, what do we do? Well, that's usually completed new players and a lot of inexperience. But there's times when an adventurer thinks it's done something, or even the GM, might not be the adventurer even. The GM might think he's done something very clear. Flee! Or surrender, whichever. But the actual message that's been conveyed to the players is neither of those. Not clearly. So being flexible, being prepared for those unexpected moments is really, really important.
Yeah. And having a way to, corral your players back into the storyline so they don't stray off too far.
Absolutely. And something like that one, think about it beforehand. Just
when you're going through your adventure, and even a written one, like a pre-made one,
Yep.
brainstorm a little. What points could the players could actually, get confused? They might have another idea that's not exactly in line with what they're supposed to be doing, like story-wise. And just kind of have a contingency plan to try and bring him back and see, okay, well, at this point they could do this, so I could potentially do this to fix it, and etc.
I think brainstorming those key points is important, and that's totally part of your prep. Look for those moments when players could screw this up.
Yeah, and that usually comes when the players get a choice.
Yes.
And you'd think that, the obvious choice is this, but you don't know what's going on in everyone's heads, so when they suddenly go, I want to kill the guard, you're suddenly going, no, you're not supposed to do that, but try and think of those kind of outcomes, and you can't think of all of them, obviously. But
yeah, absolutely. I think that those sort of ones like that, okay, this is a major thing. The players are going to be now prime suspects in an assassination of an important official. The adventurer is expecting them to do one thing, but look at that moment and go, okay, but what if they don't?
Mm-hmm.
If it's assuming they're going to flee.
What if they stand and fight?
Or if they flee and they're meant to stand and fight. So that's the thing. Take a look at those sort of key moments and go, what if they do the opposite in this case? And try to plan around that. And it'll help you not get flat-footed as much. Admittedly, we really made things hard for Nate with half the party surrendering and half of us fighting and then all of us surrendering.
Mm-hmm.
None of that was meant to happen. I think part of it was meant to be some of them were meant to escape, some of them were going to get captured, and then we'd bust them out like a prison break. Not everybody gets captured. So I think that one did throw him a bit of a loop. But those are the moments that, try to think about. Have a look at what the adventure says. Because they're the moments, right? You don't have to do it for every single place. A dungeon room, that's not going to matter. It's going to be a fight. It's going to be a trap. It's going to be loot. It's going to be something. But typically it's not going to be so many sort of options that are going to mess things up. Not like, are they meant to fight or are they meant to flee? So that's certainly something to, I think, consider. My number 2 is not knowing the rules. And I know that for rules lawyers, they hate it when a GM doesn't know the rules. To me, it's not that big a deal. There are so many rules. Mm-hmm. A new GM has to soak all that stuff up. There's a lot there. And that's why we take the rule books to sessions. Now, yes, you don't want to break the narrative flow every 2 minutes by having to look in the book. You need to have some understanding of the rules, obviously. You don't want to be in a position where you have to look to the book at every time something happens. But don't break the game just because you can't think of a rule at this moment. Usually you got time, right? Usually something comes up. Someone will say, can my ability do this? How does sneak attack from my rogue work? Someone will probably snap open their book and look it up while something else is happening. That's cool. But if you don't, unless it's a horrible thing that's going to break the game, throw an idea out there and say, we'll check at the end. And then next time we'll get it right. And I don't think that not knowing all the rules is as bad a sin, as some people sort of treat it. I mean, for me, it's a personal thing. Obviously, I'm not saying that if they feel the GM should know all the rules or a vast majority of them before GMing is wrong. It can't hurt a GM to know a lot of the rules before GMing, but there is just so many, and especially if you do more than one game. There was 300 or more RPGs at its height, and yeah, you wouldn't play all of them, but even if you played a fraction of them, they've all got a 300-page rulebook. There's no way you can remember all of them. So it's meant to be a team effort. It's not just the GM. It's players should take involvement in their thing as well. And if you get a good group, it will be shared. But don't stress that to the point of inertia. It's very easy to get so hung up on, oh my God, will I remember this rule? That you'll stop doing a good game. You know what I mean? So I think that's a very, it's high on my list because that one I've noticed a lot of new GMs really do worry about not knowing every last rule in the book. And how they're going to handle this. Like, what if a player wants to climb? What do I roll? Is it athletics? Is it a strength check? Oh my God, what's going to happen?
A lot of the time when it comes to those kind of situations where you're not totally aware of like the exact rule for it, honestly, fibbing it isn't a bad thing. As long as it doesn't, break it. Fibbing the dice and fibbing a situation or just making up a rule on the spot to suit the need is totally an acceptable thing. Just because it's written down doesn't mean it's set in stone.
Exactly. And just be honest. I think that honesty is the most important thing. If you don't know a rule, if you don't remember it at that moment, if you can't remember if climbing is going to actually be a dexterity check or a strength check, because that's the thing, is it a dexterity check or is it a strength check? Because in that moment, you might go, God, it could be either, because you could use dexterity to climb, but maybe it's strength. Maybe it's athletics. don't grind the entire game to a stop. Unless, you know what I mean? Like, just make a call. You know, if you got time, maybe someone will crack open the book, but otherwise just say, you know what? I'll let dexterity-based people roll dex, I'll let the strength guys roll strength, or roll athletics. Mm-hmm. And then you can look in the book and see which one it actually is. And then you'll probably remember that, because you'll remember that incident where you had to fib it, and then that'll stick in there, so then when you actually look up the rule, go, oh, okay, it's this. And my last one is, we did touch on already, is players doing the unexpected and not following the plot. That is the thing I think most GMs, number one, are the most unprepared for, and the most afraid of. And really, it's a mixture of all we talked about. Preparation, knowing your players, listening to your players, observing your players, and just being prepared for those moments. Thinking about, if they don't do this, is there a way to get them back on station without it being a massive problem? Because there's times you're going to think, here's the job. Take this, I'm offering you 50 gold to deliver this letter to this person. And they'll go, no, we want to go into the forest. And they're not trying to screw you up. That's the thing. They might not be actually trying to screw you up. They might think that this is a side quest that they don't want to bother with, because you might have made a mistake, which sometimes happens, of when they first walk into town, you might have said something like, you see this, and you see this, and you see a wanted board. And one of the players might have said, what's on the wanted board? And you go, oh, there's a few bounties. There's a bounty for Balrog the Devourer, a rogue dwarf. And you've just made that shit up right there. But what's conveyed to the players is, oh, there's some dude who wants to pay us 50 gold to deliver some letter. But I actually think the adventure's about this Devourer dude, because they're offering 500 gold for him. Mm-hmm. And now you're like, oh, what the hell have I just done? Because you got nothing. You just made that name up on the spot. You might even have just thrown in the bounty board description on the spot. But the players, to them, have decided that's the mission. That's obviously the adventure there. And you can say, okay, time out. Look, I'm sorry, dude, I got nothing on that. That was just description, which probably isn't a bad way to be. I think it's, if you can fudge it, then definitely fudge it. Because improv is vital for a GM. He's doing it all the time. He's doing it every time a player says, is there an inn? Is there a armory? Is there a weaponsmith? Every time they do that, you can just say, yeah, you can buy whatever you want from the book at the prices listed. Or you can create that shop. And then if you do, jot it in your notebook. Mm-hmm. Have a notebook. Oh, yeah. Every GM should have a notebook. Because there are times when players are going to say to you something that is brilliant. They won't know it. You might realize it, but you will forget it. Write it down. And because sometimes it might only be one little line that they say to you, and it might be, oh my God, I can work that into an adventure. That adventure that's coming up, that bought one, there's that bit where that guy talks about this thing, and it's unrelated, but now I can make it important to what he just said. And you suddenly got an adventure then when it comes up that's better for you and far more engaging for the player, because suddenly he realizes this is now about his background, or this is about his character directly. So always have that. Always be prepared for that improv moment, whether it is creating an NPC or a store or something. So if they do suddenly want to go charging off after a bounty, maybe you can change a villain in the adventure. One of the random encounters or something. No, not random encounters, but one of the encounters. Or maybe the guy behind it. If this is a one-off and you know it's a one-off that's not connected to any other adventure other than your own campaign, maybe you could change something about the setting to fit. Possibly the person you're delivering the letter to has a henchman, and that henchman happens to be the Devourer. Then you can try to push them into this, gently into the same thing, because if it says last seen in this town of Parnas, and then maybe they go, well, wait, that's where the guy wanted us to deliver the letter. Well, why don't we take that job too? It'll pay 50 gold. And now you've got them back on track. And no one knows any the wiser, right? So improv is important. But players are going to do that to you. Don't get mad. I've had GMs, especially young GMs, get mad. They feel like the players are now becoming the enemy.
Out against them.
Right. They're doing this on purpose. Why are you doing this to me? And it's like, they're not, dude. There's times that they just don't understand that the plot actually was going in one direction. Or maybe they're trying to do something that their character is. The rogue might be desperate to do something in a city because that's where he feels rogues exist the most, is in the darkened alleys. And he's like, well, that's where I got this great idea. I want to do this. But the ranger, he might want to be doing something in the wilderness. And they're not trying to screw you up. They're just trying to do...
Yeah, they're just doing something that they think makes sense for them.
Absolutely. And getting mad, feeling that the players are trying to do this to you deliberately. I mean, if they are, you've got a bit of a screwy group. But the moment you get mad with this, your game's gone south. You can't get mad at the players for being players. So, yeah, just learning the improv side of things and sort of that sort of on-the-spot preparation, it comes much more with practice. The more you GM, the more comfortable you are with the way everything goes together, the way it all works. And then when things happen, usually I found the more GMs do it, the easier it gets for them to just make stuff up, whatever is required. Or they'll know when not to make something up and not put something in front of the players that they might bite at that you don't want them to. Because that's the thing. Players are a little bit like putting your head into the mouth of a shark. It's gonna probably bite you. So don't ever do it if you don't want to get bit. If you don't want them to possibly charge off after some tidbit of ancient runic knowledge that you just sort of threw out there because you're being clever, don't do that if you think that they might suddenly take you up on that offer.
It's usually best don't give them the option, because 9 times out of 10, they'll probably take it. Because they'll think that they're meant to. That's the big thing. A lot of the times they think that, oh, this is the direction. And they won't be like, oh, they're trying to trick me. Because, in a way, the DM's, whatever comes out of the DM's mouth is like the word of God. So, it's kind of hard to say, but don't try and be clever with your players. Because they will fail that every single time unless one of them's really paying attention.
Right. Exactly. And that's the thing. Sometimes if you're doing especially like a Adventure League adventure or some of the Pathfinder Society ones, these are convention adventures and that. So their ideas are very small and very short and very compacted. And you might...
And very concise.
Right.
Too.
So something that comes out of your mouth might actually sound a lot more interesting than what the adventure is. And they'll be like, oh, that
must be it. It's like, oh, no. I made that up. Shit.
Or even if they don't think that this is it, they might still go, that sounds a lot more interesting. Rescuing a maiden in distress. I think that sounds much more interesting than looking for some flowers or that confusing as all hell one we did on Friday, the missing elf in the house. God.
I mean, it wasn't that bad. It's just we kind of had bad luck with the dice.
Oh, but that was a strange adventure. That one.
Oh yeah. Also, another thing that kind of leeches off this topic as well is kind of Murphy's Law. Anything that can happen will happen. So, you know, if your party's meant to go through doors until they reach the right one, you never know when your barbarian just might kind of get fed up and start tearing down walls.
Hey, man.
So, you gotta be careful with that kind of stuff.
Those damn doors, man. Tearing down the walls became a very, viable option. Thank you for suggesting it.
It's fine, since your barbarian couldn't hit anything anyways. Interior decoration was a much better job, I think.
That was such a bad game.
Oh man, you did horrible.
But that's my top sort of tips of things that new GMs can sort of get caught up with.
Mm-hmm. I kind of just said the whole time.
What else is new?
Right?
Mm-hmm.
God. I'm the Penguin. He's Ghost. Thanks for listening. God.